Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello everyone, welcome to a session on violence in society. This is a topic of universal significance throughout human history. It is a topic about which tens of thousands of books and hundreds of thousands of articles have been written and millions of journal articles considering the nature of violence, which is ubiquitous in society. I want to start off by pointing out that because the topic is so vast and so broad, and it encompasses a number of academic fields, a number of academic disciplines, from law to criminal justice, to political science, to sociology, to psychology, to history of crime. This is a topic that crosses disciplines in academic studies. Because of that, what I am going to do today is narrow on one of the three categories of violence. Violence, as most people conceive of it, think of it, the common person thinks of it, is theft, for example, someone breaking into a house and stealing something, or holding up armed robbery, let's say armed robbery, or committing homicide, killing someone at the individual level. This is behavioral, or committing a crime against a woman, gender violence. This is behavioral or individual violence. This is one of the categories. And although this is the category that the media, the mass media, and certainly most popular books and novels is what they zero in on. And politicians also, when politicians speak of violence, they speak to this particular category. However, there are two others, and those who have studied violence in institutions of higher learning, that is at the university level, know that the two others are structural or institutional violence and cultural violence. Both of these, and I'll explain what those are, both of these influence the first one that I mentioned, that is structural or institutional violence refers to the state or non-state actors, that is government or private sector institutions, carrying out policies which impact violently in one form or another, including leading to death of masses of people. The ultimate form of structural or institutional violence, as people obviously can imagine, is war. That is the ultimate form. And it is not to be compared in terms of magnitude, considering, for example, in the 20th century, more than 200 million people, 200 million people perished as a result of wars, more than 200 million. So this is the ultimate form of violence. at the state level, because war is conducted by governments. It's carried out by governments. They make the decision, behind which, of course, are elites influencing policy, whether the government ought to go to war or not. As I stated in a previous video, in fact, I dealt with this issue in a previous video entitled Human Nature and War. Another form of institutional structural violence has nothing to do with the state, but rather by the private sector. It's carried out by private sector, usually businesses, or small or large. I also dealt with this issue in a couple of recent sessions, namely child labor. Child labor is a form of violence. It has existed throughout history in many societies, and it continues to exist today. Child labor, whether in the Congo, in the cobalt mines in the Congo, in the cocoa fields of Brazil or the Ivory Coast, or in the textile factories of Southern Asia, child labor, according to the United Nations, is a human rights violation, and it is illegal. It is a form of violence against children. This is institutional violence. Then the question is, what is the connection between that and individual or behavioral violence? When the institutions are themselves engaged in violence which has become the norm, it's part of the norm, whether it's war or whether it's child labor, that violence influences human behavior. Human beings live in a society. They live in a social setting. They know when violence is visited upon them. And I'll mention more examples, by the way, for when we come, for example, to issues of IMF austerity and the impact on people who are affected economically, and they have to make a choice between buying medication or eating for the day, and a result falling ill, and in some cases dying, in other cases committing suicide. That is a form of institutional violence. And it filters down, it impacts the individual. The third category of violence is cultural violence. Cultural violence is when the easiest way to describe this is when we think of a majority population, whether it's in the United States, for example, with race issues, race used as a pretext to attack minority community individuals, or in Europe, for example, to attack migrants from Africa and Asia, that racial violence is part of cultural violence. Racial violence actually normalizes institutional violence. The interesting thing about cultural violence is that the institutions, it has filtered through the institutions. The institutions may have officially adopted a policy that says, no, we're not racist, we're against that. Although they may support politicians who are against migrants, who pursue policies and against the social development interests of minority communities, who pursue policies that marginalize the minority communities, therefore normalizing violence at that level and sending the signal to society that that group is not favored by the mainstream institution. So what we have is violence ubiquitously um, permeating society from the institutional level to the cultural, filtering down to the individual. And the last one, the individual or behavioral violence, is what people see, what the common person sees. When they turn on their television station or the radio, or they, even when they go on the internet news, they'll read a story about some husband who pulled a knife on his wife. They'll read about some individual who became inebriated, drank too much, and shot another person in a bar. And that sort of violence, or a crime of passion, someone driving like mad and um, doing doing something illegal to harm others. So violence is essentially harming other people and causing damage to property. That's violence. However, it is not confined to the individual, and the individual doesn't live in isolation on a mountaintop. The individual lives with an institutional framework. Therefore, the institutional and a cultural framework. Therefore, the individual is influenced by the institutional and cultural framework. And so today, what I'm going to do as a historian and political economist is focus on the institutional from an overview perspective to give you an idea of why this is important. In my view, the one reason I chose this to discuss this topic is because matters are getting worse. Unfortunately, on a world scale, institutionally, that is the structural violence component on a world scale is becoming worse. Not everywhere. Clearly, there are exceptions from New Zealand to the Scandinavian countries. China has shown some quite a bit of improvement in social development because it has a social development policy. And there are some shining examples. This is not to say, by the way, there is a utopian society, an ideal society. I don't mean to suggest that at all, and that there's somehow Shangri-La, paradise on earth. No, all societies have their problems, including the Scandinavian societies. By the way, do have problems with cultural and institutional, let alone China, which has a long way to go. So I decided to do this topic because under the neoliberal political economic model that we have been living in the last 45 years, since the late 1970s, since Margaret Thatcher came to office, followed by Ronald Reagan, we have seen a rise in cultural and institutional violence on a world scale. Okay? One of the reasons is because neoliberal policies have made possible, have facilitated deregulation of business, which has resulted in greater institutional violence. It has resulted in greater use of children in the labor force. And again, that's illegal. It's a human rights violation. And that is one of the worst forms of violence. This is children, by the way, that we have. So this is one of the reasons that I chose. Now, let me point out that violence as a topic, as a popularized topic, was not exactly something that really you can find much focus on by writers, by intellectuals, let's say, by intellectuals, by poets, and so forth. There is some reference to that beginning with the Renaissance during the Black Death, because the Black Death in Europe from 1348 to about 1500 or so, the Black Death didn't just end in one day, by the way. It just waned, in other words, declined as time went on, and people developed immunities. But you can see quite a bit of work in terms of poetry, in terms of art, and some references to violence, and clearly, one can understand during the plague why there would be. However, it is not until the 18th century that we do get, during the age of the Enlightenment, the 18th century is the era of the Enlightenment, that we do have a thinker. His name is Cesare Beccaria, who was an Enlightenment thinker, that we do have a more systematic view of violence. Cesare Beccaria is famous for writing a book on crimes and punishments and deviating from the mainstream thinking that existed before. The fact is that the assumptions about criminal behavior, not cultural and institutional, because that is also criminal, and we'll focus on that more, of course, but the assumption throughout the age of faith for more than 1,000 years, in Western Christendom, but also in the East, the assumption was that that the source of crime was sin, that human sin led to crime. So crime was a sin. How did they deal with criminals? Extreme punishment, from torture to execution, by the way. They also had fines. They fined people for smaller crimes, but they were severe in punishing. And the assumptions they made about what accounts for crime. Why is a person a criminal? Why is a person a criminal? Why does a person commit a crime? The great 19th century writer Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, the story of Jean Valjean, he depicted, I should say, he was a novel, he depicted in that story a poor man whose family was, they had illnesses, they were starving, and he steals a loaf of bread. Jean Valjean steals a loaf of bread. For a loaf of bread, he goes to prison. Now, we know Charles Darwin maintained that all species want to preserve themselves and perpetuate themselves. Human beings are no different than all other species. What drove Jean Valjean to steal the loaf of bread? No work. Economic conditions, institutional pressures, institutional conditions, environmental factors is what led Jean Valjean to commit this crime at the individual level. This is what Cesare Beccaria zeroed in on, having been influenced by John Locke's epistemology, his theory of knowledge, that all knowledge and that the human comes from empiricism, that is, from empirical experiences, and that human behavior is molded by the environment. The human beings live in society, live within a social environment. that environment for Jean Valjean was endemic poverty, facing starvation for himself and his family, so he steals a loaf of bread. Okay? That was the crime. So one cause of crime is what? Throughout history, poverty. Who is responsible for poverty? When a baby is born, is that baby predisposed to become a criminal? Or is it the case that when that baby becomes an adult and there is a social setting, the social environment, where there is no work, so that baby now an adult can eat and survive, what is the baby to do? Fall over and drop dead, right? Fall over and die. Cesare Beccaria, influenced by John Locke and the argument that human beings are molded by their environment, Jean Valjean followed his instinct. There is bread. This bakery had a lot of loaves of bread. He took one so he and his family can survive. That individual crime that he committed was determined by the institutions he lived in. The institutions drove Jean Valjean to steal that loaf of bread. Jean Valjean was an otherwise ethical individual and would not have done that, as the story unfolds, as Victor Hugo describes it, as those of you who read the novel know. He would never do this. If he had food, he would never. In fact, it turns out he's a benevolent individual and gives to others who are in dire condition when he becomes wealthy, as those of you who read the story know. The Cesare Beccaria theory was that the institutions must be molded, and this falls in with the rationalism of the Enlightenment, by the way. The Enlightenment is also called the Age of Reason. Beccaria was immersed in the rationalism of the Enlightenment. According to Beccaria, like the Enlightenment thinkers, the rest of the Enlightenment thinkers, with the exception of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, according to Beccaria, institutional solutions must be pursued to solve problems in society, which filter down to the individual level. Okay? This includes issues of crime and punishment. As far as punishment, he was against the death penalty, against assumptions that human beings commit crimes because they're possessed by witches, which they believed, by the way, or they commit crimes because they are inherently evil, because they have the seeds of sin from Adam and Eve, from the fall of grace, from Adam and Eve in the Old Testament. He rejected all of that. He argued what drives people to do this is the environment, the social setting they're in. The institutional structure drives people to do this. What the state ought to do is rehabilitate. First and foremost is crime prevention through institutional mechanisms. Jean Valjean, again, to take that story, I love to use that story for this particular session. Use the institutional structure to prevent crime by making sure that people have the ability to survive. Otherwise, if you marginalize them to the degree that you starve them to death, that is itself a crime and a sin, if you want to adopt the Christian assumption, by the way. He also advised against punishing, beating, and torturing people in prison, and rather that the penal system must be designed to rehabilitate human beings, not to beat them to death or execute them. He was against capital punishment and against torture of prisoners. I should point out, by the way, that the underlying goal of Cesare Beccaria, and he became very popular, by the way, in the Western world, and then influenced criminal justice thinking on a world scale. This is a very important individual in the field of criminal justice. The underlying assumption here was that the goal should be of the state, should not be to, whether through neglect or intentionally, create institutional crimes or allow conditions that lead the individual to behavioral criminal behavior, but rather to prevent. Okay. So the Beccaria goal was that society must be based on social justice. The social contract, which is became a popular idea in the 18th century, from obviously starts with Locke. It starts with Hobbes, Locke, and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote a book by the same name, The Social Contract. The social contract should be designed to encompass social justice. So if you have a social justice component, you're going to lessen crime. Clearly, Beccaria, by the way, was a realist. I want to make sure people understand because I'm going rather quickly on this material. Beccaria was a realist. He knew that there are some people who are born with mental illness and that they're going to commit crimes. The fact is, mental illness is one of the reasons people commit crimes, have committed crimes throughout history and today, to this day. We have to be realistic about that. What do you do with those people? You put them in prison, beat them to death because they're mentally ill. Here's where Beccaria comes in and says, no, you revive them. You try to bring them back to sanity. You try to find a scientific/medical solution for the problem they're having. So this is a very important step toward the modern concept of crime and punishment on the part of Cesare Beccaria. Now, Beccaria lived in the 18th century, and in the 18th century, by the way, is infamous for institutional or structural violence, because the 18th century was the century where most Africans were transported across the Atlantic Ocean in the transatlantic slave trade. What greater crime is there than that? Okay, I understand Jean Valjean stealing a loaf of bread. It's against the law to steal. Okay, the crime, sure. He was starving, no excuse. What about millions? And by the way, there's no fixed figure, and scholars disagree, on how many millions were transported across the Atlantic. How many died on the way? How many died when they arrived? This is, and this is the reason I chose this topic, not to talk about behavioral and / individual crimes, but rather institutional and structural crimes. This is an institutional crime on a massive scale, involving millions of people. Slavery was, still is, an institutional crime on a massive scale. It was taking place during Cesare Beccaria's lifetime. Okay. Now, in the 19th century, the issue of institutional crime is popularized. There are thinkers, from novelists to scholars, philosophers, and economists, sociologists, journalists, who agreed that there was individual crime. However, they made the link, as had Cesare Beccaria, They made the link between institutional crime and individual cultural norms and individual crime, down, filtering down. We see this in Charles Dickens. I've mentioned Charles Dickens before in his various novels. We see this in Upton Sinclair, and in the late 19th, early 20th century, in the 20th century, in the interwar period, in the great John Steinbeck, by the way. So we see that thinkers begin to make the connection. If you have institutional violence, it's going to filter down at the individual level. And where does it filter down, by the way? This is an important point. It's not going to filter down to the wealthy class and the middle class. It's going to filter down to the lowest classes. And this is why historically, globally, whether in Brazil, in the United States, or in South Africa, globally, when you look at the prison population, when you take a social status counted, who is in prisons, who is it? It's the poor. It's people who come from the working class. There are very few people in prisons on a world scale that come from the middle class and the upper class. This in itself confirms the connection between institutional / structural violence and individual behavior, individual crimes. This is a very important point to stress. Now, I want to point out that in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a brilliant French thinker. His name is Georges Sorel. He wrote a book, Reflections on Violence. Georges Sorel was an anarcho-syndicalist. He supported the working class. He was influenced by socialism, didn't exactly agree with Marxism, but he was certainly influenced by socialism. And he argued that the issue of violence cannot be understood in any terms other than a power relationship. That the institutions with the greatest power are the ones who have the greatest ability. War still are throughout history. That hasn't changed. This is a constant throughout history. They have the greatest ability to commit violence. For example, war. Okay, sanctioning an institution like slavery, where millions of people were transported, sanctioning child labor. Okay, not introducing legislation until very late in the 19th century, and then in the United States, in the case of the United States, in 1938 under FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, that's an institutional crime. Having children in the coal mines of the Appalachian Mountains, that's a crime. Down in the coal mines. Dying prematurely because of what they breathe down there. Anyway, Georges Sorel shocked people by, this book, Reflections on Violence, because it was very radical to say, wait a minute, he turned the table around and said, oh, violence, the people are violent? No, the state and the institutions, the mainstream institutions are violent. They're violent. That's where violence is rooted. And that filters down, becomes the norm culturally, and the individual is influenced by. In other words, this is a question of whether human beings, it's another philosophical question. Are we as human beings, as John Locke raised the issue, by the way, Thomas Hobbes, other great philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they raised the issue, are we innately violent? Most people would say yes. Look at the story of the two brothers in the Old Testament, Cain and Abel. Cain killed his own brother because he was greedy and jealous and petty and wanted to take revenge against his own brother. So he kills his own brother. People, well, look, it's in the Bible. Well, another way to look at it is that Abel is the other side of the coin, the same coin, the two brothers. One coin, one side Cain, the other side Abel. Abel was a decent human being, creative, constructive, wanted to do the right thing, wanted to do constructive things in life. And so human nature is not one-sided. And this is the point that Cesare Beccaria in the 18th century was trying to make in Crimes and Punishments when he said, rehabilitate human nature. Why are you assuming, why have the dogmatic view that the person who commits a single crime, now, clearly, as I said, there are people who commit crimes because they're mentally ill and they will commit crimes. You try to, the question is, what do? You beat them in prison as they did, or do you try to cure? Try to cure. That doesn't mean they're going to be cured, by the way. Realistic, we have to be realistic. It may not be cured, especially in the 18th century when pharmacology had not made nearly as much progress as it did by the early 20th century. Granted. Okay. But the question is the role of the state to assume the function of a punisher, in other words, violence, deliver violence to the violent criminal, or to rehabilitate, when in fact that violent criminal, minus the mentally ill cases, let's take the Jean Valjean case because for convenience purposes for us, the person is out of extraordinarily difficult conditions, starving to death for himself and his family, becomes a criminal. Yes, it's true. It's illegal to steal a loaf of bread. It's a loaf of bread, but still illegal. Fine. Okay, so he stole a loaf of bread. Does this mean that 100% the human nature of this individual, the nature of this individual is criminal, a sinner, damned forever to hell? This is the issue about human nature. The question, and again, the larger issue is, to what degree does the state and private institutions with enormous power, as George Sorel, we're coming back to George Sorel, as George Sorel noted, to what degree in the power relationship are they responsible for inculcating violence, influencing the violent behavior of the individual through policies that they adopt either at the public level or the private sector level. And that is what we need to focus on. That's what I'm focusing on today. In the interwar period, it became very clear to people who still hadn't seen it yet. Never mind from that this issue had already started being debated since Cesare Beccaria in the 18th century. But if they had any doubts, they no longer had doubts by the interwar period, the 1920s, certainly not by the 1930s, not by 1938 when Hitler and the Nazis announced the final solution, exterminating the Jews. Along with the Jews, by the way, they also targeted gypsies and communists, just for the record. So when you have very clearly a very violent state in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and they celebrate violence. The state now celebrates violence. It celebrates sending out paramilitary organizations, the black shirts and the brown shirts, the black shirts in Italy, the brown shirts, as that's what they were called in Germany. When you have paramilitary organizations going out and carrying out acts of violence on behalf of the state. Okay? So it becomes very clear in the 1930s, an agent of violence. Very clear. In the Soviet Union, in the 1930s, Joseph Stalin, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, carried out extreme acts of violence. Paranoid, having deviated a long ways from what Lenin and Leon Trotsky started out during the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Joseph Stalin, who fancied himself as Tsar Ivan the Terrible, some early era Romanov Tsar, carried out massive acts of violence. It is not known, by the way. People throw out numbers on how many people, of his own citizens he eliminated, that he deemed a threat, or they were resistant to his regime. But he eliminated a lot of people. In the hundreds of thousands, absolutely. In the millions, more than likely, probably. Why? This is the state carrying out acts of violence. Why eliminate your own citizenry? Deliver this kind of acts, this sort of acts of violence on a massive scale. Okay? This is also in the interwar period, when Italy and fascist Italy and Nazi Germany had their own violent orientation policies. Okay, now when the war ended, we have with the Cold War more subtle areas of violence, and I want to deal with those as well. In 1944, in Washington, D.C., the United States had a number of meetings, and then at Bretton Woods, they established a system where they set up the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund was, as I've mentioned in previous videos, was to provide loans to stabilize currencies for those countries that experienced monetary inflation. World Bank development loans for projects, various projects. These two institutions, led by the IMF, delivered a form of very subtle institutional violence. Let me explain why. To qualify for a loan, there were conditions. Just like when people borrow today from a bank, a commercial loan, there are conditions. You can't just take the money, give me the money, I'm walking out the door. It doesn't work that way. The conditions on the government was that it adopts certain policies. Those policies, IMF policies, then and today are called austerity. The word austerity is Greek, by the way. It means severe. Severe conditions. Those conditions meant cutting social spending, cutting public works, lowering the taxes on the rich and raising it on the working class, dismissing public sector workers, lowering tariffs to allow foreign capital to come in more easily. The net effect of IMF World Bank loans was that it impacted the working class. It impacted their health, their livelihood, their children. This was a form of economic violence. This so-called shock therapy, as a number of scholars who have dealt with the IMF, Naomi Klein, of course, comes to mind, others who have dealt with this issue, have pointed out this shock to the economy had an impact on the lives of human beings, terrorized them. They, I remember when I used to go to the IMF and the World Bank and do research for a number of countries where austerity was imposed, from Nigeria and Indonesia to Latin America and Europe. The question that I always asked is, okay, you want those people fired from the public sector? You want to reduce the size of the bureaucracy? Fine. Where do you propose putting those people? You know what the answer has been for 75 years? Nowhere. Let them find jobs. This is a form of, this is not to say that anybody took a gun and shot anyone or committed a crime, but this policy is a form of institutional violence because it brings chaos into the lives of millions. And this is why one of the reasons I chose this topic is precisely because of scale. The scale of austerity is global, and it has impacted the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Now, let me give you a statistic, since I'm talking about scale. I just thought of it. It is estimated, by the way, by the World Health Organization, by the way, those of you who are interested in crime and violence and so forth, one source is the United Nations, and one of the sub-agencies, the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization keeps a lot of statistics. The ILO, the International Labor Organization, also keeps statistics on this. And then there are private institutions that keep statistics as well. It's estimated about 500,000 people every year are killed as a result of violent crime. Okay? Now, as a result of austerity policies in the last 75 years, and as a result of policies like the IMF austerity policies that governments adopt without the IMF guiding them, but they know that's what the market requires. We have been reading since the Great Recession of 2008 that suicides on a world scale have risen substantially. That's a form of violence, by the way. When people in the United States, especially farmers, and in India and other parts of the world are killing themselves, or a diabetic has to choose between insulin that costs $500 a month and eating food, paying rent, lets the insulin go, dies, that's violence. It's not the sort of violence of some inebriated individual walking into a bar and starting a fight and killing someone. That's not the sort of violence. It's not that kind of behavioral violence. This is very subtle, very indirect, but it's institutional violence. And it's taking place. Now, I see that we only have 10, I only have 10 more minutes, so I wanted to cover terrorism as part of violence, but I think that's way too much of a topic. I think I'm gonna talk about, well, maybe a little bit on terrorism. The issue of violence and terrorism did become popularized since 9/11. It is true. People who watch me, who've seen my videos, know that I am adamantly against any form of random violence, any form, no excuses. Because I don't believe it's effective. I don't believe it's part of social justice goals to be completely discarded, period, without qualification. No excuses. I also, however, understand why those who go that route toward what is called technically unconventional warfare. Terrorism is unconventional warfare. It's a group of people who come together, they organize, and they agreed on an armed attack on completely innocent, or not so innocent in some cases, but usually innocent civilians. Okay. It is a political act. It is not a crime of passion. It's intentional. It's planned and so forth. Without a doubt. It's to be condemned universally without, no matter who carries it out, by the way, whether it's that group of people, because terrorism has become, in the last 25 years, a generic term. And everyone, all governments around the world define it the way they want to define it. China doesn't define terrorism the way the US does. Okay? Russia has a different definition than the US. Everyone defines, they also define their own terrorists. Right? Iran, which the US and Israel and the Western governments often called a terrorist state, regards Israel as a terrorist state. So you have basically this generic term, terrorism, applying to both private groups as well as states to indicate that they are carrying out violence against other groups of people. The question is, what is the solution? And why is terrorism present? Why should it exist to begin with? It exists because institutional conditions, institutional violence created it in the first place. Terrorism is how the state of Israel started, by the way. You study the history of Israel, you will find out that the Zionists who started the path towards statehood were carrying out random acts of violence, assassinations, bombings, and so forth. Okay? No different than jihadist groups today, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa or in other parts of the Middle East. Okay? So terrorism is in fact a response to institutional or structural violence. It is itself a byproduct of that. And the question is, what is the solution? The solution is political. Everybody knows. The idea that, oh my God, how complex. No. There are political solutions, by the way. This doesn't mean that everyone is going to lay down their weapons and play nice and hug and kiss and go about their business. It's a process, it takes a long time, but there are, just like ending a war, like the war in Israel and Ukraine, is a political decision, so is this one. Okay? This is part of institutional violence. It can end through a political process, only through that. Military solutions only inflame terrorism. That's the reason Interpol, the international police agency in Europe, is concerned that the war in Israel has actually exacerbated, has worsened the possibility of future terrorist acts, especially in Europe. And they're concerned about this summer's Olympics, by the way. Okay? They know there is a connection between structural institutional violence and the response coming from unconventional warfare called terrorism. They know that, and they know what the solution is. It's political. Stop the source of the problem, and you eventually will end the problem. I want to, I see I only have 5 minutes, which limit I give myself, by the way. I want to end this session about structural violence filtering down to cultural, which normalizes it, and individual behavior violence, by pointing out that violence, and I'm going to give you some statistics here if I can find them, pointing out that violence is big business. A lot of people may think, oh, how dreadful, society pays for it. Yes, society pays for it. But guess what? A lot of people make money. Anyone who is in the business of arms manufacture, one of the reasons for gun violence in America, an issue that has dragged on ad nauseum, by the way, in debates, and the American Rifle Association and pro-gun advocates don't want to end it, is because there are a lot of companies making money selling guns. But it's not just that. The fact is, violence as an entertainment venue is ubiquitous, and it's in the hundreds of billions in revenue. These are the statistics I just looked at this morning. 90% of all motion pictures have some form of violent content or other. The greater the greater the content of violence, the more money they expect to make. 68% of videos are violent content oriented. 60% of television, 68% of video, 60% of television. 15% of music video. For Christ's sakes, they're music videos and they inject violence in them. And guess what? The worst statistic is 37% that I saw this morning. 37% of the entertainment business, which injects violence in content, is aiming at children. They're deliberately aiming at children. This gives you an idea of intent and of the profit motive using. They know that institutional violence and cultural cultural violence sells, individual violence sells, and they're making money and they're appealing to children, so they grab them early. Okay. This is an abhorrent situation. But this too is part of institutional violence, by the way. This is part of institutional violence. I want to end by pointing out that the future, the near future, with artificial intelligence and violence in society and the surveillance culture we have, surveillance everywhere, doesn't speak well for at least the immediate future. It is a tragedy. It is a tragedy indeed that this is where we're headed. Because when society is experiencing a rise in institutional violence, you know that's going to filter down to cultural and behavioral violence. So it's going to become more violent, period. And if economic conditions worsen, as they are expected to for the lower echelons of society, so will violence rise. I thank you very much for listening, tuning into this channel. I ask you to subscribe. I want to say one thing about this channel that Asad Alim has. Asad Alim has a far-reaching commitment to providing quality material. No matter what he does, his aim is quality material. Nothing that does not contribute to society and to human development. So I ask you to subscribe to this channel. I thank you. The next session I'm going to take up is capitalist ethics. Capitalist ethics is the next session. I thank you again. Goodbye.